We view our global air traffic control system as a masterpiece of human order, a precise, invisible grid of radar arcs, flight levels, and transponder codes that keeps millions of tons of screeching aluminum safely suspended above the clouds. We trust that the coordinates on the radar screen correspond perfectly to physical objects moving through the atmosphere, and that the black void between the flight paths is completely empty. But the sky is not an empty canvas. It is a dense, layered fluid dynamics matrix, heavily ionized by solar radiation and saturated with nearly a century of stray high-frequency radio transmissions. If you run a high-power long-range radar station on a remote, jagged island in the North Atlantic for 50 years, the system eventually stops just bouncing radio waves off moving metal. It begins to develop a memory. The electromagnetic grid hardens, turning the airspace into a massive storage medium that begins to remanifest old flights, old frequencies, and old anomalies that should have faded from reality decades ago. My name is Arthur, and for 14 years, I worked as a chief terminal radar approach control specialist for a multinational aviation logistics firm. My specialization was oceanic tracking anomalies. When a commercial flight path crosses the vast, radar-blind gaps of the North Atlantic, they rely on long-range, high-voltage radar arrays to project their estimated trajectories. I was stationed at Facility Echo 9, a reinforced concrete radar bunker built on a sheer, wind-battered cliff face on the remote, volcanic coast of the Faroe Islands. The station was equipped with a massive, 70-foot rotating radar dish that swept across the ocean airwaves, tracking everything from international cargo freighters to military transport planes navigating the Arctic corridors. The environment inside an air traffic control bunker at night is a tense, claustrophobic bubble of high-stakes isolation. The operations room was completely devoid of natural light, the walls lined with heavy acoustic tiling that absorbed the roar of the Atlantic gales crashing against the concrete exterior. The only illumination came from the intense, circular green glow of the primary radar scopes and the sharp white text of the flight progress strips. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, mechanical click of the master clock on the wall and the low, constant 60 Hz hum of the high-voltage klystron tubes powering the transmitter on the ridge above. You learn to read the rhythm of the sweeps, watching the bright green sweep line rotate across the phosphor screen, painting clean, predictable blips of light that represent human lives moving safely through the dark. It was during a severe, freezing rainstorm in early November when the radar scope captured the Phantom. The time was exactly 3:14 in the morning. I was tracking a routine transatlantic cargo flight at flight level 35-0, heading westbound toward Greenland, when the primary radar display experienced a sudden, violent visual distortion. The rotating green sweep line didn't just paint the clean, digital data blocks of our scheduled traffic. The center of the screen fractured, the green phosphor glowing with a sudden, unstable intensity that made the glass screen hum audibly. I immediately initiated a system reset, thinking the atmospheric interference from the storm had caused a localized clutter accumulation on the receiver. As the diagnostic software re-indexed the tracking matrix, the raw audio monitor from the high-frequency radio array automatically routed itself to my headset. The oceanic radio channels normally produce a soft, comforting background hiss, a vast sea of atmospheric static mixed with the distant, polite voices of airline pilots reporting their positions. But my headset didn't produce a hiss. It returned an absolute, freezing silence that felt heavy enough to compress the ear cups against my head. I adjusted the master volume control to its maximum setting. Out of the deep acoustic vacuum of the radio channel, a voice began to materialize. It wasn't the voice of a modern pilot, and it wasn't a standard distress broadcast. It was a flat, rhythmic, and mechanical sequence of flight coordinates, read aloud by a man whose vocal print was completely identical to my own. The delivery was entirely mechanical, devoid of any natural human inflection, cadence, or warmth, repeating a set of navigation waypoints that had been removed from the international aviation charts 40 years ago. Flight 777, descending through the terminal line. The carrier wave is locked. Prepare the airspace for equalization. Before I could contact the regional oceanic control center to report a major communication hijack, the secondary telemetry terminal to my right cleared itself of the active flight list. The corporate software interface vanished entirely, replaced by a raw, monochrome command line that began compiling text at an impossible speed. The data wasn't standard aviation code or weather updates. It was an exhaustive, chronological log of every aircraft disappearance that had occurred over the North Atlantic since the early 1940s. It listed forgotten military bombers from World War II, legendary commercial propliners from the 1950s, and private executive jets that had vanished from tracking screens without ever broadcasting a distress signal. The final entry on the rapidly scrolling list was dated with the current calendar day, and it displayed my own name, my corporate employee number, and the exact geographic coordinates of Facility Echo 9. The station intercom on the concrete wall next to my desk crackled to life, the speaker emitting a sharp, distorted burst of high-voltage static that made my chest tighten. It was the voice of David, the night shift maintenance engineer who was working in the generator room on the lower level. His voice was completely stripped of its usual professional calm, replaced by a raw, breathless panic. He told me to look out the reinforced observation window toward the primary radar tower on the cliff edge. I stood up from my console, walking to the thick, multi-layered glass window that looked out over the stormy coast. The night should have been a chaotic blur of driving rain, crashing gray waves, and the blinking red obstruction lights of the radar tower. Instead, the storm had fallen perfectly still. The driving rain didn't hit the glass. The drops seemed to freeze suspended in midair, forming a dense, unmoving galaxy of water droplets around the concrete bunker. But the true horror was the coloration of the sky. Illuminated by an unknown source from above, the dense clouds directly over the facility weren't dark gray. They were glowing with a brilliant, intense, and unnatural violet luminescence that seemed to be descending from the upper layers of the atmosphere. The light wasn't static, it was shifting in slow, geometric currents that resembled the cold patterns of a solar nebula, casting long, frantic purple shadows across the volcanic rock of the cliffs. And standing perfectly still in the center of the rotating radar dish, completely unaffected by the 70-mile-per-hour wind gusts that had been screaming across the ridge just minutes ago, was a shape. It looked like a massive, geometric core composed of raw violet crystal, its surface carved with millions of microscopic, shifting lines of data that matched the flight logs compiling on my computer screens. The material was pulsing subtly, expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization, with a low-frequency seismic vibration that was shaking the concrete foundation of the bunker. Suddenly, the mechanical systems of the operations room erupted into a chaotic sequence of structural failures. The massive automated data recording decks, the heavy magnetic tape drives used to archive voice communications, began to operate on their own logic. The heavy reels spun in reverse at a terrifying speed, the magnetic tape tearing out of the housings and drifting through the air of the room like black ribbons. The primary electrical grid of the facility died, the bright overhead lights cutting out simultaneously, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness save for the intense purple radiance flooding through the observation window. From the speaker of the primary radar console, a sound began to rise. It wasn't a mechanical noise, and it wasn't the sound of the wind. It was a collective, multi-layered vocal harmonic, a wall of thousands of human voices singing a flat, microtonal chord that carried no melody and no emotion. The voices weren't shouting for help, and they weren't screaming in agony. They sounded perfectly hollow, like an automated choir constructed out of old shortwave radio transmissions and long-forgotten radar echoes. their collective breath vibrating through the steel framework of my control desk. I looked back through the observation window into the violet light of the sky, descending slowly through the glowing cloud ceiling, completely silent and unaffected by the laws of aerodynamics, were the physical remains of the missing aircraft from the historical logs. I could see the rusted, salt-encrusted fuselages of World War II bombers, the polished silver wings of 1950s airliners, and the shattered cockpits of modern private jets, all drifting downward toward the radar tower like a procession of ghosts descending into a graveyard. Their engines weren't spinning. Their landing lights were burning with that same cold violet luminescence, and their cockpit windows showed the silhouettes of crews sitting perfectly upright, their faces turned toward the bunker. The descending core didn't strike the tower. The moment the bottom of the geometric crystal breached the radius of the radar dish, the physical gravity inside the operations room completely collapsed. I didn't fall down toward the floor. My body was lifted smoothly into the freezing air, my headset cable snapping as I was pulled upward toward the concrete ceiling. The massive, 30-ton radar console, the metal server racks, and the heavy logbooks were lifting out of their mountings alongside me, breaking apart into millions of floating fragments that drifted through the violet light like industrial space debris. The transition didn't hurt. I didn't feel the sensation of suffocating, and I didn't feel the cold of the Arctic air. My consciousness was simply pulled apart into thousands of parallel data streams, my memories of land, my aviation career, and my name converted into digital code lines that were instantly absorbed into the shifting patterns of the descending core. When I finally opened my eyes, the storm was gone. I was sitting perfectly upright at my radar console inside the operations room. The bright green sweep line was rotating smoothly across the primary scope, painting a completely normal, stable sequence of commercial flight paths across the North Atlantic. The audio channels were clear, filled with the polite, routine position reports of airline pilots heading westbound toward the American coast. The night shift was over. My relief controller arrived at 7 o'clock, carrying a travel mug of coffee and complaining about the morning fog on the access road as he took over the logging terminal. The automated facility logs showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted night of air traffic monitoring, without a single tracking deviation, system error, or communication anomaly. The corporate physicians told me I had experienced an acute episode of radar-induced flashing syndrome, a temporary cognitive distortion known to happen to traffic controllers who spend long hours isolated in dark rooms, watching the repetitive, high-contrast rotation of phosphor screens and listening to the continuous low-frequency hum of high-voltage electronics. They signed me off for a mandatory 1-month shore leave, booked me a seat on a commercial flight back to the mainland, and assured me that my standing with the firm was completely secure. I try to believe their diagnoses. I live in a small, isolated cabin in the deep, landlocked deserts of New Mexico, as far from coastlines, radar stations, and flight paths as the geography of the country will allow. I live in a dry, sunny environment where there are no clouds, no oceans, and no airplanes, spending my days watching the desert floor. But 3 days ago, I looked up into the clear blue desert sky at mid-afternoon. A single commercial airliner was passing miles above, leaving a long, clean white condensation trail across the blue expanse. As I watched the white trail, it didn't dissipate in the wind. The long line of vapor began to shift its atomic structure, the white cloud pattern smoothing out into a perfect, geometric grid that stretched across the sky from horizon to horizon. And as the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert, the condensation trail didn't turn orange or pink under the light. It began to glow with a brilliant, cold violet luminescence that cast a faint pattern of radar grid lines across the sand of my yard. And if I sit perfectly still in the quiet of the desert evening, I can hear the soft, faint, microtonal chord of thousands of hollow voices singing from deep within the upper atmosphere, reading my coordinates and my employee number over and over again. The array didn't stay in the North Atlantic. The terminal line is open, and they are just waiting for the grid to equalize.